For almost 4 decades, a woman lived inside a natural cave on the side of the Great Orme in Wales. She raised children there, she survived the harsh weather there, she cooked there, she built a life there. And when other people eventually decided that her cave was standing in the way of progress, she refused to leave. Her name was Miriam Jones, but there is an important detail that makes her story even more interesting. The popular version sometimes describes Miriam as a woman who lived alone in a cave for 40 years. That is not quite what happened. Miriam lived in the cave with her husband, Isaac, and their large family. And rather than making the story less remarkable, the truth makes it even harder to imagine. Because Miriam did not simply hide in a cave for a few years. She helped turn a natural rock shelter into a home. She raised a family there. And when the outside world eventually came to take that home away, she fought to make sure her family would not simply be thrown out. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 19th century Wales. The place was Llandudno, a coastal town in North Wales. Today, Llandudno is known as a popular seaside resort, but in the 19th century, the area looked very different. The Great Orme rose above the town, a huge limestone headland overlooking the sea. People had lived and worked around the Great Orme for generations. Fishing, farming, mining, and other forms of manual work were part of everyday life. For families without much money, a natural cave was not necessarily some terrifying place at the edge of civilization. It could be shelter, it could be storage. And with enough work it could become a home. This was the world into which Miriam Jones was born. Much of her early life is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Historical records about ordinary working families from this period are often incomplete. But by the middle of the 19th century, Miriam was living in the Llandudno area with her husband, Isaac Jones. Isaac had been born in Amlwch on the island of Anglesey in 1811. The couple eventually settled in a natural cave on the Great Orme. And this was not simply a temporary place where they slept, it became their home. For years, Miriam and Isaac lived inside the cave while raising their children. The exact number of children varies between accounts, but the strongest local historical sources commonly give the number as 15. And among those children were 3 sets of twins. That means this was not one person occasionally sleeping in a cave. It was a family home. Imagine the space. A natural chamber in the limestone, rock forming the walls, an opening exposed to the outside air, the sea not far away. And inside, a family trying to carry on with ordinary life. There would have been cooking, cleaning, sleeping, childcare work, and all the small routines that come with raising a family, but there was something unusual about this home. It was literally inside the mountain. The family became known locally as cave dwellers, and Miriam eventually became known as Miriam or Ogof. In Welsh, Ogof means the cave, so her name became closely connected with the place where she had spent so much of her life. But living in a cave did not mean that Miriam had completely separated herself from the world. Quite the opposite. The Great Orme was becoming increasingly important to visitors. Llandudno was developing into a seaside resort. Tourists came to the area to enjoy the scenery and the sea air, and Miriam found a way to make a living from this growing tourist trade. She and her family eventually moved out of the cave after being forced to leave, but Miriam continued her connection with visitors by running a small refreshment business from her new home. She became known for providing drinks and refreshments to people passing along the marine drive. This is one of the most interesting parts of her story. The woman who had spent decades living inside a cave eventually became part of the tourist life developing around the Great Orme. But before that happened, Miriam and her family had to face a serious problem. The outside world was changing. In the 19th century, roads and transport links were being improved throughout Britain. Llandudno was growing, and plans were made to construct the marine drive around the Great Orme. The proposed road would pass through the area where the Jones family's cave was located. For the people planning the road, the cave was an obstacle. For Miriam, it was home, and she did not want to leave. The dispute eventually became serious enough that the family refused to move simply because somebody had decided the land was needed for a road. Miriam and Isaac wanted another home before they would give up the cave. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The family was given a cottage. Only then did Miriam agree to leave the cave. The year was 1877 by then. Miriam and Isaac had spent roughly 37 years living in the cave. Some later retellings round this period up to 40 years, which is why the story is often described as 40 years in a cave. But the more precise figure commonly given by local historical sources is about 37 years, and there is another correction worth making. Miriam was not alone during those decades. She lived there with Isaac and their children. That distinction matters because raising a large family in a natural cave for nearly 4 decades is extraordinary in its own right. And Miriam's story did not end when she finally left. She and her family moved into the cottage that had been provided as part of the agreement. But Miriam had already learned something important. She knew how to survive, she knew how to work, and she knew how to turn whatever space she had into a home and a source of income. The new cottage gave her something the cave never could, a place where she could run a small business. As tourists traveled around the newly developed roads of the Great Orme, Miriam began serving refreshments. Her home became connected to the visitors passing through the area. She was no longer simply known as a woman who lived in a cave. She had become a familiar local character, and the nickname Miriam Ogof stayed with her. The cave itself, however, did not simply disappear from the story. The natural chamber where Miriam and Isaac had raised their family was eventually incorporated into the buildings around the Marine Drive. Today, the original cave is associated with the area of St. Petrox. What was once a family home hidden in the rock became part of a very different landscape. The road that had forced Miriam out eventually became one of the defining features of the Great Orme, and the world around her changed dramatically. The quiet landscape of her younger years was becoming a destination for tourists. The same place where a family had once depended on fishing, farming, and local work was now attracting visitors from far beyond the region. Miriam lived long enough to see that transformation. She also lived through enormous changes in Britain. When she was born, the modern Victorian age had not yet begun. By the time she died, railways had transformed travel, seaside tourism had become a major industry, and towns like Llandudno looked completely different from the communities of her youth. Miriam herself lived to the age of 91. She died in 1910. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had spent much of her life living in a natural cave lived long enough to see the world around that cave transformed. The place that had once been her family's shelter became part of a growing tourist town. The road that had forced her family out became a permanent feature of the landscape, and the woman who had once been known simply as a cave dweller became part of local history. But perhaps the strangest part of Miriam's story is how ordinary her life seems once you look past the cave. She was not trying to become famous. She was not attempting some extreme experiment. She did not disappear into the wilderness because she wanted people to wonder where she had gone. She was a working woman raising a family in a difficult period. The cave was simply the home her family had, and she made it work. That is what makes the story so difficult to imagine today. We tend to think of a cave as somewhere people explore for a few hours. You put on a helmet, you carry a light, you look around, and you return to a house with walls, windows, electricity, running water, and a bed. Miriam's experience was completely different. For decades, the cave was where her family returned at the end of the day. It was where her children grew up. It was where meals were prepared. It was where the family slept. And it was where Miriam spent a huge part of her life. Yet there is another detail that makes her story stand out. When progress finally came to her doorstep, Miriam did not simply accept that her family should move because somebody else wanted the land. She resisted, she negotiated, and she eventually secured another home before leaving. That small detail tells us something about her character without needing to invent what she thought or felt. She may have lived in a cave, but she was not powerless. She had built a life there. And she expected the people who wanted that land to recognize that. Today, it is easy to look at the story and think about how uncomfortable the cave must have been. But that is judging the past through modern life. For Miriam and her family, the cave was familiar. It was the place they knew, the place where their children grew up, the place where they spent decades together. And when they finally left, Miriam carried that identity with her. Even after moving into a cottage, she was still remembered as Miriam of the Cave. Her nickname survived because the cave had become more than just a shelter. It had become part of who she was, and that is why the story has lasted. The most accurate version is not the story of a mysterious woman who vanished from society and spent 40 years alone underground. It is stranger in a much more human way. It is the story of a Welsh woman who, together with her husband and children, made a natural cave into a home for nearly 4 decades. It is the story of a mother who raised a remarkably large family under a roof made of stone. It is the story of a woman who watched the outside world change around her. And when a new road threatened the home she had built, she refused to simply walk away. Eventually, the road was built, the family left the cave, and Miriam began another chapter of her life. But the name remained, Miriam Ogof, Miriam of the Cave. More than a century after her death, the name still tells us where she came from. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about her story. The cave is still part of the landscape, the road is still there, the town is still there. But the woman who once raised her family inside that rock is gone. What remains is the memory of someone who took a place most people would consider impossible to live in and turned it into a home. For nearly 40 years, the cave was not a curiosity to Miriam. It was simply where life happened. And sometimes the strangest historical stories are not about people who did something extraordinary for one unforgettable day. They are about ordinary people who somehow managed to live extraordinary lives for decades. Miriam Jones did exactly that. She entered history not because she wanted to be remembered, but because she built a life in a place where most people would never have imagined living. And long after the last family meal was cooked inside that cave, the Great Orme still carried the name of the woman who once called it home, Miriam of the Cave.